Good morning. Why don't we start off with a prayer this morning? God, thank you for this time that we have together. Thank you that we can read your word and worship and be together even if it's virtually. So much going on in the world. We pray for the family of Linnell Waters and for those who are going through things with the pandemic. And God, we just are grateful that we can trust you and rely on you in all kinds of situations. And we're going to spend our time today looking at your word in a situation that Paul went through and learn lessons from that feel very familiar to our time. So I just pray that we can get exactly what you want us to out of this chapter. Help me to say the right things. And God, thank you for how you love us and take care of us and that we can trust you in every way. Amen. Okay, it's great to be together. Hope this will be an encouraging time. The title is an encouraging start. I can't take credit for that. Paul is the one who gave us the title. We'll see that as we go along. But we're going to look at Acts chapter 27 today, which is an amazing story. I wanted to start off. It's my fault about the intro music. You probably tuned in this morning and saw and heard the music that was on by Gordon Lightfoot and said, "What in the world is going on?" That is a strange intro song and maybe not appropriate for a church service. I put that on because it's interesting how similar it is to the story that we have. And it's one of the great story songs, and we're reading one of the great story chapters today in the Bible as we go along. It's really remarkable as we look at chapter 27 how much of the Bible the Holy Spirit devotes to a simple story that really doesn't go into a lot of preaching or theology. It's mostly a telling of the events. The chapter tells us a story about Paul going through a shipwreck. So that's really what's going on. I mean, there are certainly some moments where he's teaching and being spiritual because he's a spiritual guy, but mostly it's telling the story of their trip. And so it's quite interesting in that way. We're going to respect that, and we're going to take the time to look at the story in the first half of the sermon, because evidently God thought it was important. So we're going to just kind of walk through that. We're not going to read the whole chapter. I think that might get a little dull as we go along. You can read it on your own in detail. But we're going to walk through and look at the story, and there are a lot of interesting elements to the story. We won't even get the whole story. Half of chapter 28 also deals with this same event. That chapter 28 is the happy ending part of the story. Somebody else gets that next week, but that'll be great. But the story we have is a compelling story and a great story. So we'll look at that in the first half. And then the second half of the sermon, we're going to have 5 short lessons. And they're short, so don't panic when you see 5. But we're going to look at 5 lessons that we can apply to our life and our situation as we go through as we've looked at the story. So let's take some time to look at the story. They get on this ship. Paul has been arrested in Jerusalem, as we read last week. They get on the ship near Caesarea in Israel, and it starts out, we'll read in verse 1. It says, "When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius." The centurion is a very central figure in the story, so pay attention to him as we go along. A centurion named Julius who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from I should have practiced this word, Andrammatum, about to sail for the ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. From there we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Sicilia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. So if you have one of those maps in the back of your Bible, it might be good to be where you can flip that, because it's interesting to look at the distances involved in this. So they've actually, in this first part, sailed quite a great distance. They sailed all along the coast of Israel, up along Syria, along Asia Minor, and now they're down near Cyprus. And so they've covered quite a lot of ground in these early verses. And that's what's good. They change ships once they get to this place. They get to an Alexander ship that is sailing to Italy, and the crew gets on there, and so off they go, and they sail on towards Crete. We're going to pick up in verse 8. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens near the town of Lasea. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous by now because it was after the fast. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that the voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to the ship and cargo and to our own lives as well." So that's where the title comes from. You know, they get on this ship, and here's Paul. Now you got to think about this. They've got a professional crew sailing the ship, that own the ship, that are seamen. They know what they're doing. They know what time of year it is. That's one of the elements in the song of the intro. They're sailing across the lake in the song, but they know it's late. They know there's potential danger, and they're very wary of it. And they're in exactly the same situation here. And Paul warns them. You know, Paul's a prisoner. He's not a sailor at all. He's a preacher. He's a prisoner being taken to Italy. So that's the guy who steps forward and offers him advice. Tells him, "Look, don't do this. It's going to be a great loss to you, both the ship, the cargo, and potentially our lives." So he puts that out there. But the centurion, verse 11, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete facing the southwest and the northwest. Okay, so they decide, even though Paul advised them, don't go, they decide they're going to go anyway, because that's what the group that knew what sailing was about told them to do. If you look at your map in the back of your Bible and it has those cities, what you'll see is the distance between Fair Havens and Phoenix is very small. It's just a little ways along the bottom of Crete, which is not a huge island. And so they're trying to just make a short distance. You know, there's something that's said here that's interesting to me. You know, you go on a trip. When you go on a trip, we like efficiency. We like to be able to cover a lot of miles, get to where we're going in a hurry. We're very used to, we talk about, do I want to fly or do I want to drive? Oh, it'll take a long time to drive. I don't know if I want to drive. It's too slow. It's amazing to me that they're talking about, we're going to make a stop up here. Well, how long is the stop going to take? Until spring. We're going to stay there for the whole winter. You're on a trip because you're a prisoner going to another place, and there's going to be a 2 or 3, however many month delay that you're just going to hang out in port because the time's not favorable. There's so many things that we have in life that are easy that we don't think about that kind of stuff. But they're just trying to get a short distance so they can get to a suitable place and then stay there all winter and then go on with their trip. So that's interesting. We're not going to read every bit of this, but he picks up in verse 13. They start this short little leg of the trip. At first, they think things are going well. They get a gentle wind. It's blowing in the direction that they want. They think they've gotten what they wanted. But then the storm that they feared shows up. They get blown off course in this violent storm. And they take they take an incredible beating. They're caught in the storm. Verse 18, it says, "We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw cargo overboard." That's an amazing thing. I mean, these guys are in the business of transporting cargo. They're at incredible risk. They were just going a short distance along the coast of Crete They've now been blown away from the coast of Crete out to sea, and they're in great danger. In so much danger that they throw over the cargo that they're being paid to transport. This goes on for days and days. On the third day, they start throwing over parts of the ship that help them sail safely. They throw over the tackle. I don't know everything involved in this. Look, I'm not a sailor. Chandler or somebody else that sails probably would have a lot better feel for what they're throwing overboard. But if a sailor's throwing overboard the stuff that helps them do their job, they're worried about what's going on. They no longer see the sun. They don't see the stars. They give up hope. In verse 20 it says, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. They're gonna drown. It's a disaster. There's a line in the song from the intro. It says, when the main hatchway caved in, the cook says, fellas, it's been good to know you. That's the point these guys are at. They don't have hope anymore. They're sure they're going to die. Verse 21, Paul comes back into the picture, and it's interesting how he chooses to do it. We'll pick up there. After the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Oh, Paul, did you do that? Did you say I told you so? He did. And he did tell them so. I think that he's doing it because he's about to give them a different kind of message, and he's trying to establish some credibility. But he says, guys, I told you this was going to happen. You should have listened to me. He says, you should have listened to my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of God, an angel of the God whose I am and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he has told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. Paul gives them an encouraging message. He says, look, this is bad. You guys think we're all going to die, but God told me that none of you are going to die. They're encouraged by this message. He was right when he told them not to sail. He reminds them that he had warned them of that, but then he turns around and says, look, God has said you're all going to live. Just moments before, they were sure they were all going to die, but now he's telling them otherwise. That's exciting for them, I'm sure. They had been at this for 14 days. 14 days without any kind of peace, without eating. Some of the guys, as this goes on, after Paul had told them this, decide they're going to sneak off the boat on a lifeboat. It's interesting what Paul does. Verse 31. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it fall away. Julius had had enough of not listening to Paul. Paul says, look, if these guys leave, you're going to die. And Julius takes the sword and cuts the ropes, and the boat's gone. So they're not getting off the boat now. He's listening to Paul from here on. He's done listening to the other guys. Verse 33, just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You'll need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. This was a big ship. Like the ship in the song, it was huge. I love the graphic that was on the title slide, but that's a little boat. There's 276 people on this boat. It's a big ship for those times. And those are the people that were on board. So they ate, then they throw the rest of the food over. They realize that they're coming close to land towards the tail of the chapter. They take soundings. They realize the water's getting shallower and shallower. They eventually cut the anchors, cut the rudder. I don't understand that because I'm not a sailor. I think you'd still want to be able to steer. But they cut the ropes that control the rudder, put up the sail, try to make land, and they hit a sandbar on the way, get stuck. The ship comes apart, but they all get to shore safely. That's the story. Go back and read it in detail. It's an exciting, exciting story. So anyway, what can we learn from this? I think there are several applications that we can make in life from this story as we live our lives. Lesson number 1. Oops, I went back too far. Let me scroll through and see, I gave away lesson number 1 and went back. Application, lesson number 1. You might get shipwrecked in life. It happens. Most of us are going to get shipwrecked at some point or another in our life. What do I mean by shipwreck? I want to distinguish here. You know, some of us call things that are really just minor detours shipwrecks. You know, we're overly dramatic. Maybe we're not used to trouble, so we think something's really serious when it's not. Sometimes there's just minor detours. Let me illustrate. This Friday, we're in the middle of a huge remodel of our house. It's exciting stuff, but if you've ever been through a remodel, even if it's exciting, even if it's going well, even if the work that's being done is great, if you're living in it, it gets a little old, and we're ready to be done. Well, it's an exciting part when you're remodeling a kitchen, when you get your new countertops. Okay, that's a turning point there. We were supposed to get our new countertops on Friday. Called and they said, no, we're not coming. These are our current countertops. If you know me, you know that those aren't the countertops that I'd probably like to have. I didn't even sand the wood. I just threw stuff up there. They don't match. There's old caulk on the wood. It's not great. We've been living with these countertops for a while. That's a minor detour. It's not tragic. It's not a shipwreck. Why didn't I do a better job putting the countertops on there? Well, because they're temporary. They're short term. I don't really care that much. It's just something to hold up the coffee pot and the teapot and the stuff until the countertops come in. It's a minor detour. It's not a shipwreck. You might get shipwrecked though. Look, some of us go through stuff. There are hard things that happen in life. Maybe you've lost somebody close to you. That's a shipwreck. That's hard. Maybe you've gone through terrible financial struggles. Maybe come to almost financial ruin. That's a shipwreck. That's hard to get through. Maybe you've had issues in marriage or in other ways in life. Those things can really take it out of you. Perhaps you've had issues with a child. Perhaps a child that was following God made a decision to turn away from God or to do other things in life that just break your heart. That can really affect your faith. That can be a shipwreck in life. There are hard things that we go through. Look, if you haven't gone through terrible hardship before, you will at some point in all likelihood. That's the way life is. It's tough sometimes. And, we have to get through that. A few things about shipwrecks, it doesn't mean God doesn't like you. I think sometimes when we go through a shipwreck, we think, well, God must be angry with me. God doesn't like me. He's displeased with me. He's punishing me. God wasn't unhappy with Paul. That wasn't the point. Paul went through a shipwreck, but God was very happy with Paul. He was on God's business. He was doing what God wanted him to do. But he still went through a shipwreck. So it doesn't mean God doesn't like you when you're going through a tough time. We gotta understand that and hang on to that. Another thing we got to remember is God uses shipwrecks. God uses difficult things through his people to accomplish great things. It's striking, if you read the Bible, how difficult the lives are of God's chosen people most of the time. Throughout all of the Bible, all the people that we admire and look up to, they went through very difficult time periods in their life. And some of God's best work was accomplished during those times, during the shipwreck times in their life. So God uses those times to do great things if we will stay faithful to him and keep a hold of him and keep in the right spirit. Trusting God when we don't understand is really important. I don't know that Paul understood why he was going through a shipwreck. There are things that I've gone through in my life that I don't understand why I'm going through them. There are things that I've seen other people go through that honestly are difficult to understand. And I wish that I could give you the answer to all those things. I'm not, I don't have the answer to all that. But we go through tough things, and God uses it to do good. And, we could try to sort out, well, is God causing that? Is he allowing that? It's stuff that happens, and God uses it to accomplish things that are great. Look, we're going through a time as a world right now where we're going through a shipwreck. This is an unusual thing that's happening. It's very rare that the whole world goes through something at the same time together that is affecting so many lives. And we're doing that right now with the pandemic and with other things. Our country and our world is in upheaval. We're going through a shipwreck, and that's something that we can learn from. But God uses those things to do good things. Application lesson number 2. Life might be different than you expect. I don't think this is what Paul expected. It's interesting. Paul gets to the point where he's following God. You have the whole road to Damascus experience, and God says, you're going to be the apostle to the Gentiles. You're going to do great things, Paul. I'm going to have you do a lot. It's interesting. He's going to be a messenger to kings. Wow, that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Yeah, you might drop that at a party. Well, I'm destined to speak to kings. That's what God has called me to do. I'm pretty much going to be the king evangelist. My job is I'm going to go take the gospel to kings. That sounds impressive. And maybe Paul knew what he was in for. God said he would show him how much he must suffer. So I don't know exactly what Paul knew and didn't know, but I do know that being a messenger to kings sounds a whole lot more exciting than what's happening in 27. And being a messenger to kings sounds great, except for the part that most of his preaching that he did to kings was as a prisoner, in chains, under capital crime investigation. He might lose his life. That's probably not how you want to be the messenger to kings, but that's the way it actually played out. Maybe not what he expected. Very often in our lives, God accomplishes his purpose in unexpected ways. It's like the great old hymn, God moves in mysterious ways to get things done. Sometimes the greatest work is done in ways that we would have never thought of or expected, and that happens in a very personal way. God did what he said he was going to do. He just did it in a different way than Paul might have chosen or might have expected. And Paul was probably surprised at the method. Application number 3. God often uses hardship for his purposes. We talked about that a little bit earlier, and we may not like that lesson, but it's true. God uses hardship to get things done. Again, I don't always understand why he works that way, but he does work that way. Here's an important thing, though. Paul has a great attitude through the whole time. Paul doesn't lose faith. Paul doesn't give up. Paul stays spiritual while he's in hardship. That's hard to do. When we're going through tough times, it's hard to keep that positive spirit and that spiritual focus. But Paul does that in a great, great way. And we need to imitate that example. And he was willing to let God work through him in hard times and stay faithful to God. You know, there are many times that God reorders the world, and he does it purposefully. And again, I don't understand all of the things that happen. Let me give you an example. If you remember the Daniel series that Kyle did a while back, you see a great example of this in Daniel chapter 2. We're not going to read all this, but in Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and he's trying to figure it out. And he calls he calls all of the wise men and the astrologers, and he asks them to interpret their dream, and he makes it harder because he's not going to tell them what the dream is. That's kind of a tough ask. But then Daniel comes along, and he tells him what the dream is. And you remember the dream. We're not going to read it, but you remember the dream. He sees this statue, and the statue has a head of gold, and then silver, and then bronze, and then iron, and the feet have iron mixed with clay. And we know what he's talking about in this circumstance. Nebuchadnezzar is the Babylonian king. He's the head of gold. Daniel tells him that. He says, somebody's going to come after you, and he's talking about the Medo-Persian Empire. Then, the bronze is a reference to the Greek Empire, and the iron is a reference to the Roman Empire. And at the end of this whole thing, in Daniel chapter 2, he says, while you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. And it comes down and it breaks the statue apart and goes through that. But in verse 44, he says, in the time of those kings, the northern kings, the Romans, in the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it ever be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will in self endure forever. Now, here's what I want you to see in this. Why am I bringing this up? Here's what I want you to see. God used all of those circumstances to prepare things for Jesus and to prepare things for the church to be established. The Medo-Persians came along, and instead of keeping the Jews captive, they sent them back to their homeland to rebuild the temple, to rebuild the city. They even paid for a lot of it to get done. And so the place where Jesus would appear is set up. The Greeks take over everything. They have a worldwide empire. And look, all of these things that were going on, all of these kings, none of them were particularly righteous, and there was a lot of brutality involved in these things. There was a lot of evil involved in these. There was a lot of things about these people that weren't holy, that weren't righteous, that were terrible. And the people who were going through these things thought it was bad stuff. So the Greeks take over the whole world. But you know what we got out of that? Or what they got out of that in that time? They got a common worldwide language that everybody understood. So when it was time for the message of God to spread throughout the world in the first century, they had a language that everybody understood, that they could communicate with, and a common understanding that allowed the message to spread easily. The Romans come along and take over. And when the Romans come along and take over, they provide, the Romans had a lot of problems. There was a lot of bad things they did, but they were a better government than some of the people that had come before them. They put in infrastructure. They put in a system of government that was useful in a lot of places. And so even though they opposed the church, a lot of the things the Romans did facilitated the spread of the church. And as Daniel predicted, during the time of the Romans, the rock cut out without hands, the kingdom of God was established and spread all over the world. God used the hardship that happened during all those times to accomplish his purpose. And so, that's going on. How many times in the last 100 years have we seen great hardship? We've seen wars, world wars. We've seen other situations where there was illness and problems, and and civil unrest and the civil rights movement and all of these things, and the unrest in the 60s related around all of these social things that happened throughout the last 100 years. What we're going through, a lot of those things have happened before, and God has used all of those circumstances to help spread the message. He's going to do the same thing in our time. Our world is changing again. Look, I already told you, I'm not smart enough to know how all this works. I don't know what the plan is, but I know something's happening, and I know that God will use it. And yes, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of hurt that's going on in the midst of this, and I don't mean to minimize that. And there are things that are wrong that are going on that need to be addressed. And yet God will somehow use all of it to advance his kingdom. We got to have faith in that. We've got to stay faithful to him as we go through that. Lesson number 4, the invisible man. There's an invisible man in this chapter. You may not realize that. I don't mean that there's somebody in in Acts 27 that you can't see, that somehow or other he's invisible literally, but he's invisible in the text almost. There's a lot of times in there he's actually quite prominent. There's a lot of times in there he's referred to, but not by name. Frequently in chapter 27 you will see the word we. Well, who is we? If you want to know the answer, you can read 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11. When Paul writes Timothy, he talks about how some people he sent out to work at different cities, some people had unfortunately lost their faith and abandoned him. But he says something that's poignant and tells us the answer to this question. He says, only Luke is with me. Luke is the guy who's writing the book of Acts. He's there on the boat with Paul. And he's such an important... Look, if there was ever a guy that needed his own personal physician to travel with him, it's Paul. He's always getting beat up and stoned and thrown in jail. He needed a doctor with him, and God provided Luke. And Luke is there with him. It's a first-person storytelling that's going on. It's plural, but it's first person. He says, we got on this ship. We sailed here. We did this. We did that. Luke's right there with him, even though you don't see him by name. Look, people and churches need Lukes. We need people that are there to do what needs to be done. People who don't need the spotlight, who don't need accolades, who don't care, what letters they have after their name. They just want to help God's work get done. We need Lukes in the church. And we need Lukes in our lives that are there to support us and help us and get us through the tough times. Here's my petition to you. Be willing to be Luke. It's easy to want to be Paul. He's famous. He gets lots of press. Everybody pays attention to Paul. Paul he's the movie star. Luke is the extra, the guy whose name maybe doesn't even appear in the credits. Be willing to be Luke. If God's work's going to get done, we have to have those people. And so somebody has to be willing to be that person. And then the second admonition is you got to let Luke be Luke. Sometimes the problem isn't a lack of people who are willing to be Luke. Sometimes we're too prideful to let somebody serve that role in our life. Or we try to hold back somebody from giving to us in that way. Let somebody who God has put in your life that wants to serve you and help you and support you, let them fill that role. Don't be proud. Paul needed Luke, and he had to recognize that he needed Luke. I think he was grateful for him. But we've got to let Luke be Luke, and we've got to be willing to be Luke. Last lesson. You don't know what you're doing. Now, you probably agree with that, especially these days. But that doesn't mean what you might think it means. Here's the thing. In Acts 9 through 20, Paul is on the big stage. I mean, we've been reading it together, so you know, I don't have to tell you. You've been reading along as we've gone. Paul is doing exciting big stuff. He's preaching to crowds. Whole cities come out to hear him. Great miracles being done. Thousands of people becoming disciples. It's such exciting stuff that when they go back, it's standing room only to hear it. Let us hear the story about what happened while you were on your trip. And people are fired up, and they ought to be. I mean, it's exciting stuff. Paul is getting it done. That's Acts 9 through 20. Acts 21 through the end of the book, Paul's got a very limited audience. And throughout most of that time, he's in jail. He's in chains, quite literally. Paul's no longer speaking to the big crowds. Paul's no longer on the big stage. He's in a dark cell. He gets dragged out or in a house under arrest. He gets dragged out from time to time to tell his story to the most recent potentate that wants to hear about it. But Paul he's a very limited audience. Here's a question for you. When did Paul have the greatest impact? Which part of Paul's life affected the most people? I would argue that it's the second part. Now look, both of them are important. Okay, it's not like one's important and one's not. But Paul affected thousands or tens of thousands in the early part. But when did he write most of the Bible? The most of the New Testament that we read? It was largely during the second part. Millions have been affected by Paul's writings. And yet that happened when he was in a much more limited kind of situation. Was that his plan? His plan was, well, I'm actually going to do great things while I'm in jail. No, I think he was doing, Paul was doing what he could and turning it over to God. But I imagine when he was going through those times, he felt like, wow, I'm not accomplishing much. I'm in jail. I'm not going from city to city telling them the message of God anymore. I think that as a church, a lot of times we feel like we're not meeting together. How can we be having impact? How can we be getting great things done? You know what? You got to do what you can and give it to God. You might be surprised at what you're actually accomplishing. You may not know what you're really doing. It may take time. Look, check back with me in 2,000 years and tell me what part of your life was the most impactful. It's hard to tell when you're going through it. The key is be faithful and give it to God, and God will do great things with what you give him. This is an exciting chapter. There's a lot we can learn. We kind of glossed over it. We hit a few lessons, but I hope you'll go back and read it. There are other ones to pull out of there, and I'm sure you'll enjoy doing that. And next week you get to hear about the end of the story, which is very exciting as well. We don't have time to do it today, but you can look forward to that next week. If you're going through a tough time, hang in there. Be faithful. God's going to use it. Stay grateful. Give your heart to God, and he'll use what you're going through to accomplish great things. Have a great day, guys, and a great week, and have a great time remembering God in the Lord's Supper as we celebrate that together.